And so would love for you to be here. And so this morning is God's gift to the misguided. Tomorrow we'll look at God's gift to the masses. But as we begin, a question for you. Have you ever stumbled across something you weren't looking for? Maybe find something better than you were looking for. I'm not talking about your keys or your lost wallet or those kinds of things. March of 2017, 14-year-old Daniel Christensen from Denmark was given an assignment from school to research World War II. Come up with something and share it with the class. So he went home and told his father about the assignment, and the two of them began talking, and they were reminded of their grandfather and this story that he used to tell of a plane that crash landed on their property, a swampy part of their land out beyond their farm. And so they just assumed that it was a tall tale that Grandpa had told to kind of liven excitement. And so 14-year-old Daniel sets out with a kind of lay of the land and a metal detector, and over time discovers buried deeply in one of their farm fields a Messerschmitt Bf 109 that had crash landed there in October 1944. Stumbled across far more than he was expecting, thinking maybe Grandpa was making up this story to kind of give the kids something to talk about. And so over time he dug up most of the pieces. It was in those pieces you can see in the picture, eventually even finding the pilot still in the cockpit. In the gospel, I want you to see this morning that in the gospel we get far more than we're looking for. And maybe even more than we think we need. Like the past couple of texts, we'll answer the first question of who is this being offered to, and then what's being offered. So the theme this morning, the title this morning, God's gift to the misguided. Well, who are the misguided? We meet them right away in verse 1. In the days of King Herod, behold, wise men from the east came, the Magi, as they're often referred to. So Magi is the word we get the English word magician from. They were consumed with interpreting dreams. They were kind of workers of divination and sorcery, supernatural leaning. Right? They're pagan astrologers. They kind of practice magic. So this word magi is much more closely related to who they are than the wise men or the three kings, as we sing occasionally at Christmas. We three kings of Orient are. These are pagan astrologers, consumed with the stars, the supernatural, sorcery, everything the Old Testament prohibited. They're rich. They were able to fund their own way from where they were from into Jerusalem. Very well educated, committed to knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge. Not what knowledge pointed to, but knowledge in and of itself. Always learning, always studying, never arriving. Much like the phrase that you hear, life is about the journey, not the destination. Maybe you've heard that, maybe you've said that. Right? It's knowledge for knowledge's sake. Not what knowledge leads us to, not what knowledge points us to, but it's about the journey of knowledge, not the destination. And that may sound great. Try that next time you're going somewhere with your kids, right? Almost get to Disney, almost get to the Grand Canyon, almost get to Six Flags, wherever you go, and then turn around. Kids, it's about the journey. It's not about the destination. No, it doesn't work that way. But we think in terms of this phrase when it comes to knowledge. It's not about what knowledge leads us to and sinking our teeth and closing our mind on something. It's just about study. It's just about knowledge. It's just about learning. It's not the case. And these magi, as educated as they are, as rich as they are, as wise as they are in all of these crafts, are spiritually lost. They're lost in spiritual darkness. They come, the text says, from the east. We know there are a couple of options where this is. One is Babylon, modern-day Iran, because it was the home of astrology. The pursuit of these kinds of sciences and these kinds of thoughts is from that area. But verse 11 tells us the gifts they bring are gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, gold is common everywhere, but frankincense and myrrh are not. They're from southern Arabia, modern-day Saudi Arabia. And so they're from somewhere, those directions. We don't know exactly where. But in the Jewish mind, this phrase that's used, they came from the east, means they came from the east of the Jordan. They're from the other side of the river, right? We know this, the other side of the track, the other side of town, the other side of whatever that line that we so often associate with when it comes to demarcating us from someone else. In the Jewish mind, these men were from the other side of the river. They're not one of us. And one of the profound implications of the gospel is that there is no us versus them. We so want to cling to that to find our identity and our hope and our comfort, the us versus them. But the gospel demands that is erased. There is no us versus them in the gospel. There is only in Christ, as Paul talks about, and outside of Christ. The Christian and what a friend of ours used to call pre-Christian, not non-Christian. So pre-Christian is there's a hope there. There's a hope that God can still move, God can still work. But there is no us versus them. But one of the questions we have to ask is, how do then these men know all of these things? They're from Babylon, they're from Arabia, right? And they say in verse 2, where is he who's been born King of the Jews? How do they know? So the Babylonian captivity took place in 587 BC. Many of the prophets are writing during that time. So God uses Babylon to come in, take the Jewish people back to Babylon as a way of punishing them for their sin. One of those was the Babylonian captivity. One of those took place with the prophet Daniel. You remember Daniel? We know these stories, Daniel in the lion's den, and Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they chose to put their foot down and say, we're not going to follow the laws you're giving us. We must obey God. We must follow what God has called us to. And right away in Daniel's book, the book of Daniel, we see Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, is having these dreams he can't explain. So he calls in all of these men to answer the dreams. They can't do it. And they say, no one can do this except for a God. Word gets to Daniel. He shows up. And in Daniel 2, Daniel tells King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he goes on to tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream is about. To the point that then Nebuchadnezzar takes Daniel and puts him in charge of all the wise men, all the magi in Babylon. It's an amazing thing that God does, orchestrates even then. And so now, again, Daniel is full of all kinds of prophecy about this Messiah that would come. All kinds. And coupled with just Daniel's testimony of God is all of the Jewish people that are there living in Babylon as slaves. And you have God's people now sharing God's promises of hope in a foreign land. And as you read the Old Testament, you see this. They're in a land that doesn't belong to them. They want to go home. They want to go to the temple. They want to be back in God's presence. And they're living out their faith in a foreign land, imprisoned, in bondage. You see the same thing in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul imprisoned, Apostle Peter imprisoned, singing, right? Sharing the hope of the gospel. To the point that Paul eventually will say, there's not a single soldier in all the imperial guard who does not know. Doesn't mean they believe, but he's not shied away from every opportunity to share the gospel, to sing these hymns before these men as he's imprisoned. Then we're met with this star. They come in and say, where is he who's been born the King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him. We don't know exactly what this is. It's a supernatural phenomenon. The word astera is where we get the English word asteroid. It's kind of this image of a star being strewn across the sky. Right? It could be a comet. It could be a lining of the planets. But it's a moving thing. And so some believe it's even the glory of God. Right? Leading the people as the Israelites through the wilderness. This pillar of fire that leads them and stops and leads them and stops. And so in verse 9, it talks about the star coming to rest over the place where the child was, regardless of what it is. We don't need to get hung up on the detail there. God is moving and God is leading them. Right? We look at some of the stories that we've looked at already with Caesar and issuing this decree. It's a profound thing to think about. These prophecies of the Messiah that would come 500, 600, 700 years before his birth, of where he'd be born. And so in order to move Joseph and Mary to where Jesus had to be born, Caesar, under the authority of God, issues a decree that everyone on the world must be counted. And God begins maneuvering an empire to bring Joseph and Mary to where Jesus had to be born. But more than just an empire, here we see God is maneuvering the cosmos. Whether it's a star, multiple stars, planets, an asteroid, it doesn't matter. God is working and God is moving and God is stirring. Because the greatest thing ever to take place in the history of the world was happening. God himself taking on flesh to dwell among us. You don't think he can maneuver some stars? It's an amazing, amazing story for us. But we have to be reminded, again, these men are pagan astrologists, magicians, sorcerers, workers of divination. They're not just wise men, 3 kings. David Mathis says that Gandalf and Dumbledore are coming to worship the baby Jesus. Right? This is the kind of, we tend to think of that this isn't real, right? This is make-believe. But these are the kinds of people that are on their way, following a star of all things, to come and to worship. And in the midst of their sin, God is pursuing and drawing them to Christ. And ultimately, because of that, back to himself. We use the word repent all the time. It means to turn around. And we tend to think, again, in terms of, I'm living this way in sin. To repent just simply means to turn around and walk this way. And there's an element of truth to that. But to repent means to turn back to. And here it's the imagery of God leading these men, ultimately, through Christ, back to himself. But it's interesting, they show up not in a field like the shepherds did. They go to the temple. And they walk in, right? We so often associate with our nativity sets, 3 wise men. Right? Because of 3 gifts. But the reality is we're talking here potentially of up to hundreds. A caravan of these men and women coming into the temple, into this palace where Herod was. At this point, it's believed that Jesus could have been up to 2 years old. And we'll see eventually, we don't look at this text this morning, but in verses 16 and 17, this Herod realized he's been tricked, and so he has all the children under 2 years old killed. So they show up, walk into the temple, into this palace, into Herod's presence himself, and ask the question, where's the king? The implication here, the way that the text is structured, right, in verse 1, in the days of Herod the king. And then eventually we see verse 3, when Herod the king heard this. And right between those is this question that the Magi ask. Where's the king? Where is the king of the Jews, the one to be born? Right? So you can almost hear Herod saying, no, I'm the king. No, where's the real king? Not you. Not the one that assumed control, took power, the one that is being given power from on high, the one that is born the King of the Jews. You ever go out to dinner and have a bad experience and say, hey, excuse me, can I speak to the manager? Or you're on the phone and have horrible customer service and the question is, can I speak to your boss? No, I'm the boss. Oh, great. Here we go. Can you get your boss then? No, I run everything. Right? They show up and ask this question to the most powerful man ruling this kingdom. Where's the king? No, I'm the king. No. Where's the real king? Where's the boss? You're not him. I need to see who really runs the show here. Herod was a wicked man. Wicked. Killed his own wife and her two brothers in order to maintain control of the throne. Hated by the people, extremely violent. When he first took control of the kingdom, he brought in the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish leading authority, kind of the ruling authority of the Jews, and killed them, just massacred them. To say, I'm in charge now, and you do what I say. You see, even here, as they show up, the Magi show up, Herod the king heard this. He was troubled in verse 3, and all Jerusalem with him. You can imagine, rightly so. If he's troubled, and he has this kind of anger and this kind of temper, they better be troubled as well, because it's going to mean trouble is coming. So much so that in verse 16, as I said earlier, he realizes he's been tricked by the wise men, becomes furious, and kills all these children, age 2 and under. This is not a new thing for Herod. And so one of the great understatements of this text is verse 3. He was troubled. You can imagine to be confronted with the question, where's the king? You realize your whole authority, your whole kingdom, all the power that you've clung to, your entire kingdom is now up for grabs. And this true king, in verse 6, listen to what he will do. Coming from this prophecy in Micah 5 of Bethlehem and who's, the birth of this Messiah that will come, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. He will shepherd. He will care for, will lead and guide and comfort. It's an amazing contrast that this prophecy is coming up against Herod, because he did none of those things. Our hope as Christians is centered in this child. Our hope as Christians is not centered, like many other faith systems, in a certain law, certain regulations, certain stipulations, certain do this and avoid this. It's not make a pilgrimage to here. It's not centered in a place on the planet that you must go. Our hope, all of our hope is centered in this child, the one who was born, who will shepherd his people. What's amazing and really sad at the same time is that these Jewish religious leaders are 5 miles away from the birth of the Son of God, and they're now confronted by these magi who've traveled potentially up to 800 miles, walking, riding camels for 6 months to come into their presence and tell these Jewish leaders about their Messiah. You're Jews. Your king is being born. Tell us where. We're looking for his star. They're 5 miles away, and they refuse to go and worship him. The Gentiles found him, and the Jewish religious leaders refused him. And one of the amazing things that this text holds up for us is the reality that God is constantly pursuing those who are far from him. Constantly pursuing those that are far from him, misguided in their own pursuits. It's an amazing thing that more Muslims have converted to Christ in the last 14 years than in the entire 14 centuries of Islamic history. And one of the ways that you listen to their testimony, and most of them have some kind of story about Jesus showing up in a vision, Jesus showing up in a dream, God is still pursuing those who are far from him in ways that we don't even see and we can't understand. And what's still amazing about these magi in verses 10 and 11, they show up, and it says, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. They're still missing it. They're still focused on the wrong thing. They see the star and they're rejoicing. And then verse 11, everything changes. Going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. So even up to that moment, them walking in the door, they were still focused on the wrong thing, still misguided in their pursuits. And now they come in and they've stumbled across something far more amazing than they could have imagined. And everything in their world changes. The pursuing love of God meets us when we aren't looking for him. In grace, God meets us as we are. Please hear that. In grace, God meets you as you are. But in grace, he does not leave us as we are. Remember, Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. All of us, spiritually lost, living in spiritual darkness, Jesus comes to pursue us. They offer their gifts, which we'll look at in a minute, and then we're confronted again with this miraculous intervention on God's behalf. Being warned, verse 12, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So again, God's been miraculously intervening up to this point, continues to do so. Right? This prophecy that they heard from Daniel or from the Jews, Daniel was written 500 years before this. This wasn't 5 weeks or 5 months. This is 500 years they've been holding out, still clinging to these promises that the Jews had told them. God intervenes in this star, whatever that was, and God intervenes here in a dream to tell them to go. Go back home another way. In other words, there is nothing in this story, nothing in our lives that's left to chance. Nothing. And so there's significant hope for us, for you. So if you're here and you're like, I don't even know why I'm here. My family invited me, I'm here. You're not here by chance. God is at work. So what then is the gift to us? The gift that comes to these misguided men. Well, there's profound significance, probably even prophetic aspect to the gifts that they offer this baby. And all that Jesus came eventually to do. Again, they've stumbled upon far more than they know with gifts that are far more important than they possibly could have imagined. So all these gifts are right there in verse 11. They come in, they see the child, they worship him, then opening their treasures. Amazing word. They open their treasure and they offer him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And these are symbols for us of what the gift is to us. In the giving of these gifts, these wise men are actually pointing to things that they themselves need and all of us need. And we have in the gospel. So the gold. As our conquering king, Jesus offers constant care. It's been said that in the past 20 years, Legos have increased in value more than gold. If you're looking for a gift for me, I'll still take the gold. Right, so on average, gold goes up about 10% a year. Legos over the past 20 years have gone up about 30%. So if you have I think it's the Death Star. Like in 2007 was worth $500, now it's worth like $4,000. They don't bring Legos, they bring gold. Gold is always associated with affluence. It's always associated with wealth and power. And often, in positions of power, those things are used for themselves, to advance their own means, to advance their own kingdoms, to advance their own power. And one of the amazing things about the gospel is that this is then used for others. This doesn't just land on Jesus' lap and esteem him and build him up. He uses these things, his life itself, for the sake of others. Paul writes in Ephesians 1, in Christ we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace. Riches of his grace. He could have held on to that. And he uses it for the sake of others. And the reality is we've grown accustomed to imperfect rule of politicians and governors, of presidents, of tyrants and dictators. We don't know what it looks like to see perfect rule. We don't know what it looks like to see someone have absolute authority and power and use it for the sake of others. You may have heard this phrase by Lord Acton. I don't know if Lord was his first name or not, but Lord Acton. Everybody knows Lord Acton. So he says, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Nobody will vote for a self-denying ordinance. In other words, nobody's going to take a vote for something that they themselves are going to lose in. And I would say that is an absolutely true statement this side of heaven. That is an absolutely true statement when tainted with sin. Yes, that is true. Because in the gospel, all of that is flipped on its head. Power doesn't corrupt. Absolute power does not corrupt absolutely because that power is used for the sake of others. So again, in verse 8, this Messiah that would come, who would be a ruler of the people, for the people, who will shepherd my people Israel. And as our perfect king, Jesus rules, he shepherds, he leads those who need to be led. He's a defense for those that are powerless. He delivers those that don't have power in and of themselves to do anything. He provides for those in need. He cares for those full of needs, which is all of us. All of those things describe us. Defenseless, unable to deliver ourselves, poor, needy. And Jesus uses his authority and his power to offer constant care as our King. That's why one of the things in the prophet Isaiah that we talk about in these titles of Jesus, our everlasting Father, our Prince of Peace, is that the government will be on his shoulders. And there's a reason why. Because that's the kind of rule and the kind of authority and the kind of care that we long for. Psalm 72 is a great place for you to look this week. It's a messianic psalm. It's all about the king. And as the Jews would read this, they would know, Absalom, you didn't do that. David, you failed in that area. Ahaz, you didn't do that. All of the imperfections in these psalms about the king point to their longing for the true king that would come and rule with absolute authority. They point to the kind of king we all need. And that's what this gold points us to. That as our conquering king, Jesus offers us constant care. Frankincense. As our great high priest, Jesus offers continued compassion. So, frankincense is kind of a compound word that just means important incense or costly incense. It's very costly indeed because of where it comes from. And it shows up in a few places in the Old Testament, all related to temple worship. Leviticus 2. And how offerings are to be done, and how the priests are to structure these offerings and use them before God. And this points us to the reality of Jesus being our great high priest. Not just a high priest that goes in once a year, but our great high priest that reigns with God on our behalf. See, the role of the priest is different than the role of the prophet. The priest was to represent the people to God. I'm going to, as a priest, stand between man and God and represent all of these people before God himself. So the prophet was the opposite. I'm going to represent God to the people. And so what God says, I speak. And so the priest would represent these people to God himself. And as our great high priest, Jesus intercedes for us. And intercede can mean two different things: to pray for or to stand in the gap for. And both of those things are true. As a great high priest, Jesus is able to sympathize with our weakness. The author of Hebrews does an amazing job in chapters 4 and chapter 7, walking us through what does this look like for us? That Jesus is able to sympathize with our weakness. This is where the continued compassion comes. He sympathizes with our weakness because he's been tempted in every way like us. In every single way like us, yet without sin. This is why Jesus coming and being born in human flesh, taking on human flesh, matters so significantly. Jesus didn't appear at age 33, live for a few weeks, and then die. He was born under the law to redeem those, as Paul would say, who are under the law. He must take on flesh. He must live among us if he's going to die for us. And as a result, then we can confidently draw near to the throne of grace to receive mercy and find grace, because Jesus himself has been tempted like us. Hebrews 7, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. What does that mean? Jesus is a great high priest, frankincense being offered. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for me? It means that every situation you face, every single moment of your life, when there's joy and victory, when there's trial and defeat, everything in between, that Jesus walks alongside of you and, more amazingly, represents you perfectly to the Father. He intercedes for you. The third gift of myrrh shows us that as our suffering Savior, Jesus offers confident covering. This too, very, very costly spice, again from southern Arabia, shows up in John 19. Jesus has been hung on a cross, dies, they take him down, and Nicodemus shows up with 75 pounds of spices for burial. One of those is myrrh. And this is at the heart of what we celebrate, is not just a manger, but the manger that leads to the cross. Jesus was ultimately born to redeem humanity, right? Not just live perfectly and show us how we ought to live. That's true. But Jesus didn't live ultimately to be just our example, but our substitute, our sacrifice. That's why we sing at Christmas, mild he lays his glory by, born that man no more may die, born to raise the sons of earth, born to give them second birth. Jared Wilson, in his book, The Imperfect Disciple, says the things about ourselves we hope Jesus doesn't see are the very things he means to cover with his grace. But to cover them rightly, something had to bleed. Truth is, we love covering up our own sin. We love just saying, no. We come into these doors, how you doing? I'm great. Don't ask me about how the drive here was with my wife or the kids, or how this last week was, or the things that I'm struggling with and battling. We just assume I've got to come in clean. I've got to come in with the right answer. I've got to come in and cover up everything that's going on in my life. It's amazing as you look even back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve sin. God says, where are you? He knows where they are. Something changed in their sin. And so they grab some leaves and cover themselves. You can just picture God shaking his head. No, it's not supposed to be this way. So the text says that God then clothed them with the skins of animals. The implication being sacrifice had to be made. In order for you to be covered appropriately, there's a sacrifice that's needed. But again, as we talk about getting far more than we imagine, far more than we deserve, all of these are gifts that these wise men, these magi bring, that reveal to us that in the gospel we get far more than we need, far more than we imagine, far more than we thought we could ever need. I shared a couple weeks ago that our first Christmas together, for our first year anniversary, I gave Julie this book that had a ring inside, and a few years after that, I don't remember exactly how long, I got a nose hair trimmer for Christmas. I thought, okay, yeah, I need that. It's fine. And in the end, it was a gift that I needed. It's not a gift I wanted. You know, you think, I want TV, I want, whatever the latest technology is. I think at that time it was like Palm Pilots are really cool. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Pre-flip phone. The things that we think we want are actually the things we don't need. And the things that we need, we don't tend to want. Right, our son has an alarm clock that randomly goes off at noon or at midnight. Why? I have no idea. We just go in and unplug it and plug it back in. And we said, hey, buddy, you got some Christmas money. You should buy an alarm clock. It ain't happening. You're not going to convince a 14-year-old with Christmas money to go buy an alarm clock. He wants Legos. He wants models. He wants those. You're not going to you couldn't convince him to buy a model or to buy a new alarm clock. Because the things that we need are usually not the things that we want. There are two responses that we see in this text. And there are usually two responses associated with the gospel. The first we see is that those who are near are actually quite far from what they need. And their response is one of being troubled in verse 3, leading to fury and rage, because they recognize, these Jewish leaders, Herod himself, they recognize that if this king is coming, my kingdom falls. And that is one response to the gospel. The second is that those who are far off, again, as we said earlier, you kind of think of Gandalf and Dumbledore, the people that you would least expect to show up, the people that are furthest from the kingdom are the ones that are actually brought near. And their response when they saw the child was worship. So those are the two responses that we can approach this morning with. You can look at Jesus and see the threatening nature that he brings as a king that shatters your earthly kingdom. Or you can, with humility, bow yourself. That's what the word worship here means, to prostrate yourself before him and worship him. They opened up their treasures. What a great word, that we treasure the gospel. Treasure means you place it above everything else of value in your life. So treasure the gospel. So, again, as we look at this text, in many texts, I want to remind you that in the gospel, we get far more than we're looking at, far more than you may think you ever need. Christmas is this week, so Tuesday you'll gather, you'll have friends and family there, and do you have turkey? Do you have ham? Do you have sweet potato? All the food that's placed out, right? Ham and turkey is not, if you put tofu out, please don't shape it like a turkey. It's not turkey. Just have turkey. But I would encourage you this week. Again, we take these nativity scenes and throw together these things. And there's nothing wrong with that, of having tradition. You know, the shepherds and the wise men there, even though the stories don't align. I'd encourage you this week. Take one of those shepherds. Put it on your, not shepherds. Take one of those wise men, those magi. Put it somewhere prominent to be reminded of God's intervening grace in your life when you weren't looking for him. Be reminded of the beauty and the simplicity and the majesty of the gospel and what he's done to accomplish that for you.